Welcome back. Let's survey the structure a bit of the book of Exodus. Did you notice any macro themes as you read the text? Did you notice that the narrative pretty consistently is telling the story of Israel from bondage under a Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, through Moses' birth and preparation and his calling at the burning bush, and then his struggle with Pharaoh and the plagues in chapters 5 through 11, and then the Passover, chapter 12, the Red Sea, and then on into the wilderness of Sinai, where at first Israel battled the Amalekites in chapters 13 through 18. Did you notice that in the midst of narrating the desperation of the Israelis, an important continuity cue in chapter 2, verse 24, for example. Let me grab that. 2:24. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then again in chapter 6, verse 5, and furthermore I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because of the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. 'Tis true. This part of the narrative deals mostly with the top line elements of the promised covenant. Remember? A nation being established, that people being blessed. But don't miss the Midianites in this story. Some of them being grafted in, at least as another token of the bottom line of the promise of bringing the blessing of salvation to all peoples. And then, what happens in chapter 19? The narrator is still recounting history, but it seems to me that the camera position changes, and then it zooms in on a particular subject matter, namely God teaching Moses, and through him, teaching the people of God. Look at chapter 19, verse 3. Exodus 19, verse 3. And Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, and saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now then, if indeed you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people, and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded them. Verse 8. And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So, these words, this message, these instructions that God is giving through Moses are to a people already chosen, right? Already in a covenant relationship, right? Already rescued, right? And God said, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. So, I put it to you that the teaching that follows now is not in order to get chosen by God. It's not in order to get in covenant relationship with him. It's not in order to be redeemed. Rather, it's because of what God has already done. These instructions are not means, they're ends. So, if a person is chosen, covenanted, redeemed by this one-of-a-kind God of the universe and of all history, then how many other gods would it be appropriate to have? None, right? And so you see the first four instructions focus on the believer's attitude toward God. And then the next 6 describe how a believer ought to relate to the rest of humanity created in God's image. Now, as we head into chapter 20, I'm going to let you English Bible students in on a little secret that the Hebrew students already understand. And that is that in classical Hebrew grammar, the grammar of the First Testament, the form of the imperative, thou shalt, is only ever used to express a positive command in the second person. You must, you shall, right? Now, that's not to say that there are no prohibitions in the text. But the classical way to express a prohibition is to use the negative particle, lo, don't, with the imperfective form of the verb. The imperfective form of the verb is how you would express action in the future. I will, you will, she will, they will. Or to express a modal, I would, you should, he could. So, for example, back in Genesis chapter 20, verse 9, Abimelech, remember the Philistine king, complains to Abraham, you've done things to me that should not be done. Here's the should not be done. There's the grammar. There's the syntax. Or 1 Samuel 13:19. Philistine policy made it so that, and here our grammar and syntax comes to play, Philistine policy made it so that, the text says, a blacksmith could not be found. It's not thou shalt not be, but you with me there? I'm saying it's the same syntax, the same grammar. So my point here is to say that the grammar and syntax of Exodus chapter 20, I think it's accurately translated, you shall not have other gods before me. You shall not make a carved image for yourself to worship. But what I'm suggesting is this very same grammar could just as accurately be translated, you wouldn't have other gods. You wouldn't try to whittle God down to size. You wouldn't take his name, his reputation, his presence, his power, and treat it like, what's the big deal? You see, again, these are not rules in order to. They're characterizations because of. This is how one in faithful covenant relationship with this great God would live. Sort of reminds me of something someone in the other Testament said. I think it went, you'll recognize them by their fruit. Oh, that was Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. You see, Torah cannot save. Torah teaches how I can reflect God's character. Torah teaches how I can cultivate righteous relationships. And in doing so, it reveals the nature of sin and sin's hold on the human heart. So, we read more discipleship instructions in chapters 21 and 22 and 23 and 24. And then we get to the beginning of chapter 25, and we've got more instructions now, but I see a theme here. These instructions are focused more on what it means to express reverence for this covenant-making, covenant-keeping God. And we learned about ways that he wants to provide tangible reminders, object lessons of his unfailing presence. So, in chapters 25 through 40, we have this narrative that recounts how God, after rescuing them from the enemy, provided everything they needed for life: water, manna, and godliness, instructions in God's righteous expectations, and to minister to their post-traumatic stress. He provides tangible reminders that he would never leave them or forsake them. He gives them a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then the tabernacle, which both by name, Mishkan, abode, and by substance, was a constant reminder of God's powerful presence, shakaning, abiding in their midst. Amazingly, God tabernacles, He dwells among His people. But the tent of meeting was not only a place of assurance, it was also a place of atonement and cleansing. And something else gets unpacked in this narrative. Remember back in Genesis 12:7 when the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And then again in chapter 15, I mentioned that a bit ago, where God tells Abe that He brought him from Ur to give this land to possess. And He confirms this element of the promise with a covenant when God says, again, "To your offspring I'll give this land," but the closing date won't be for another 400 years. Well, Exodus reports that God was not forgetful of His promise. So, first 18 chapters, history. Then chapters 19 through 24, Torah instruction, revelation regarding covenant living in general. And then chapters 25 through 40, worship, reverence, attributing worth to this great covenant-making God. Thinking about theme, well, what would you say is the theme of Exodus? I'll give you a suggestion. I think one way of expressing the theme would be living with the sovereign rescuer God who is present. Remember, the central event recounted in this section of Torah stands as a dramatic symbol of God's loving project of redemption. Remember, within the first 8 verses of the book, the readers made painfully aware of the devastating plight of God's people and their desperate need for a rescue. And then it tells how God has been preparing His choice leader to rally them and lead them out and teach them how to live in covenant relationship with this one-of-a-kind God of creation and of history. So Genesis ends, Exodus begins with God's people out of the land, and Exodus narrates how God's going to get His people back to the promised land. It also unpacks a bit more of their mission as a priestly kingdom. I mean, think of it. What's the role of a priest? It involved representing the people to God. It involved representing God to the people in teaching His Torah. It involved seeking God's will for the nation. And that was to be the role of this whole faith community with respect to the rest of the world. Later on, we'll see Isaiah citing God's claim that this priestly kingdom would be a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. Again, all peoples, all nations. So, Exodus teaches personal responsibility before God, and it reminds me that my choices have an impact on my destiny. Think about that. We'll see you in a bit.